This is a very special, unique interview with Jonathan Roth, an old friend who's been in the capital markets for 15 years, and prior to that was a TV producer with tremendous experience all over the world. He's one of the few journalists that interviewed Robert Mugabe from Zimbabwe. In addition to that, he's been influenced by two key people that, in one particular, I know extremely well, is John Malden, and then it was George Friedman. So tell me about your journey of meeting John and then meeting George and how they influenced your global perspective.
Well, thanks, Frank, for having me on. Yes, I met John back in I guess it was 2011. And John was, just this ball of energy, as you know, and the guy is a prolific writer. So he really introduced me. I was always interested in economics. My beat in journalism was politics. So there was always an economic side to it. But John was really the one who opened the door to a greater understanding of how the world truly works. And so we've been friends for a long time. I've worked with him for a long time, still working with him now on various projects. So I was just down at his 75th birthday party down at his place in Puerto Rico a couple of months ago, I guess 3 months ago, and he's doing great. But yeah, so through John actually is how I ended up meeting George a few years later, George Friedman, who founded Stratfor and then went on to found Geopolitical Futures. And George has been a really key for me to understanding, I think, really how politics and geopolitics, they're slightly different, both of them, and how they kind of interplay, and particularly how the U.S. Relates to the rest of the world in a military sense. So, and there's obviously economics underlying pretty much all of that. So it's really, as I tell a lot of people, I've had a PhD in the study of money over the last 15 years, and I think it's really been influenced a lot by John and George and a few others as well. Even you really opened my door, especially to when blockchain came crashing through the door here back in 2014, 15. But yeah, it's been an interesting ride here, especially over the last 15 years.
George Stratofor, I used to often watch their videos on YouTube to be informed on geopolitical dimensions from a really, to me, always found a fascinating perspective. And so I've been blessed just to watch those videos. You know him really well, and that's what's so impressive. And John, I know him for a long time, and for those listeners not aware, John Malden was originally in theology school before he went over and pivoted to become an incredible economic writer. And his first love was gold, and he really understood the world of gold and the drivers for gold. But the big part that I want to ask John to come on, Jonathan Roth, to speak to us today is because his program is Resource Wars. And we're clearly seeing President Trump make comments regarding Greenland and Panama. And these are resource wars, and try to articulate and try to understand. And I was listening to an interview of yours, Jonathan, only a week ago or so that you did with the Malden Group. And I thought it was so fascinating when you were giving how many icebreakers the Russians have, and now the Chinese are making a claim for it. And then all we hear from President Trump is Panama and Greenland. And I don't think a lot of listeners understand the geopolitics. And then it's the 51st state's going to be Canada, where you're based. So this whole understanding of where we are in this geopolitical framework, I had an interview the other day, and we were on a webcast with three-star General John Evans, and he was commenting that the nature of war never changes. It is people that are very power hungry or they're resource hungry. And third is some type of revenge that leads to the nature of it. But the other hard part is really the technology and why you have to be technologically advanced at all times, because if you don't have a good force shield around you, you will get invaded by one of these three nature people. So now we have resource battles. Can you give me some feeling of what you're seeing and hearing regarding Greenland, China, and Russia?
Well, the Arctic is more important than ever, as I think it's finally emerging into the public consciousness that the Arctic is incredibly important, especially for U.S. strategic posture globally. But it's really become important because the seaways up there are opening up. So now there's, as some of your viewers might already know, there's a seaway that's opened up between Russia and China where there are now vessels that are able to transit that in the wintertime because it's opened up. So as the Arctic, as you know, the planet's definitely warming to a certain extent. Who's causing it? We can have that debate. But as it warms up, obviously the Arctic warms up, the ice goes away, and vessels are able to transit that region, which means the trade all of a sudden, instead of having to go down through the Suez Canal and deal with all the geopolitical problems there, or go all the way down to the Horn of Africa, it really opens up trade, especially for Russia, China, the United States, Canada, and Europe for moving energy flows and such. So I think Russia and China recognized this probably way sooner than NATO did, than the Americans and Canadians did in terms of its importance. And I think that's best illustrated, as you mentioned, the whole story about just the icebreaker disparity in terms of the numbers. And just to kind of lay it out for your viewers, so the Russians have 40 icebreakers that are polar capable, which means they're capable of working in the Arctic. 10 of those 40 are nuclear powered ships. Okay. The
Wow.
Chinese have 3. Okay. And those are also Arctic capable. Well, between the Canadians and the Americans in total, there's 3. There's 3. So you can see that the Russians and the Chinese have put a great emphasis in terms of transiting that part of the world, and we have not. And the Canadians now, we're trying to ramp up shipbuilding programs to try to push out. I think there's a couple of icebreakers that are going to be made available by 2030. But this race is on now. This is 2025. And they have this huge. They're outrunning us in that category to a great degree. And what lies beneath this is that there is a great deal of value that lies beneath the seabed in the Arctic. And maybe the best thing, because most of the Arctic has been unexplored for energy and resources just because of the nature of the cold weather there. And it is extremely difficult to explore there. As you talk to any company that's ever done work there, they say it's very, very expensive. But the reward is potentially enormous. So just in the Beaufort Sea, which is just north of Northwest Territories and the Yukon, that area, the Arctic Ocean up there,
It's
in the
right beside
Beaufort Sea.
Alaska, correct?
Yeah,
Alaska.
right by Alaska. There's a boundary dispute, interestingly enough, between the Americans and the Canadians. You're going to understand why here in a moment. So in the Beaufort Sea, they estimate that there's somewhere around 130 to 140 billion dollars worth of natural gas there. And the Canadians back in the 70s had explored putting a pipeline in that would move that natural gas, the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, down through into the U.S. And just back in 2017, under the Trudeau government, finally, the companies involved in that canceled that plan. But that gives you just an indication of what kind of wealth lies beneath the seabed there. So all these countries know it. They know what's there. The Chinese have declared themselves a near Arctic power, which means that they want to be very active up there. And, basically the Americans and the Canadians have been late to the game. Canada is incredibly militarily, we don't spend 2% of GDP on our military, and the Americans have been very upset about it for quite a long time. And I think what's going on here between Greenland and the U.S. and ourselves up here in Canada is that the U.S. is saying, look, we have peer competitors that are racing to grab these resources, and if you're now prepared to stick your flag in the ground and say this is ours and protect it, then we're going to do it for you. And I think that's what's going on. We can get more into the detail of it, but that's kind of a broad overview.
I also saw in some of the research that all across the border of Russia are something like 20 missile stations with missiles pointed at North America, in particular the U.S., to fly over the Arctic. And there used to be the DEW line in Canada. It was an early warning to protect. But what has Trudeau done to protect, and how many soldiers do they have? Because it's supposedly less than 60,000 soldiers in Canada.
Well, I have a very close family member who's in the armed forces, and I can tell you that Canada has some issues in terms of projecting power anywhere. So let alone within our own country. So up north in the Arctic, pretty much all of those radar stations still exist. They're trying to upgrade as many as they possibly can. But the reality is that I think there was always a sense that maybe satellite-based detection would be better. But as we already saw with the Chinese balloons that floated over North America over the summer, last year, it's clear that what is up there is not good enough. So they're scrambling to try to come up with a new system. There's talk. Trudeau had announced that they were going to spend a whole bunch of new money, of course, under a new government that wouldn't be his, to try to upgrade what's going on up there. But I think what it boils down to, if you're Trump and you're his advisors, you really have to take a look at it this way. Canada has always rejected having some sort of missile defense system, so continental security that way. And we have always shot down the idea of putting nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. And I think what this is about is that, look, China's able to float these balloons across, and we didn't detect them until they were too late. What happens if the Russians or the Chinese decide to send something else bigger? And if the missile defense is not located in Canada, it means it's in the United States. And if they shoot something down, it's going to go down over Canada. And I think there's a negotiation going on here where the U.S. is saying, look, you need to put missile silos up in northern Canada so that we can, shoot stuff down before it even reaches your shores. And at the same time, the bases that are up north are not prepared. They're not large enough to handle any sort of serious influx of military hardware up there. And the best illustration is there's a base up in Inuvik, very, very small base. Maybe you could take, 10 F-18s, 12 F-18s, which is Canada's fighter jet of choice at the moment. We have F-35s coming. But in November, they just finished extending the runway for that air base, because up until then, for F-18s to land at that base, there had to be arrestor cables. So the same way you see arrestor cables on aircraft carriers, there was an arrestor cable system up in the far north that obviously when the weather's terrible, it's almost impossible to use a system like that. So they just extended that runway. But that's a problem that they have across the Arctic, that these bases need to be upgraded. So my sense is the U.S. is saying, look, we need at least a couple of bases up there. There can be joint Canadian forces, U.S. forces stationed up there, because the other side of it is that Canada has Arctic Rangers that we have positioned up there. There's 5,000 of them, and they're given 200 rounds a year with a bolt action rifle, and they patrol this huge swath of northern Canada. And obviously they're doing yeoman's work, and they're willing to put their lives on the line. But that's probably not good enough considering the threats that we face, especially in this new environment where drones are a problem. We can see what's going on in Ukraine right now. You put flesh and blood on the battlefield, and they're target right away. So there needs to be more technology put up there, and I think the Americans are just pushing Canada and saying, look, you're going to do it. There's no more negotiation anymore. Obviously, we can have a conversation, but we're going to squeeze you until we get what we want.
You would give me some,
I think that's what's going on.
Producer, some insight into the drones, and the biggest and the best drones are DJI, and DJI dominates. They're the best, but they dominate sales. And you were telling me something earlier that surprised me regarding the inauguration taking place.
So DJI is the largest drone manufacturer in the world. They have over 70% of the world's market in terms of drones. I'm a television producer, run a production company. We do a lot of films and documentaries. We use drones all the time and have been for well over a decade. It's always been DJI Drones, because the truth is they're the best. So up until now, there has always been this technology incorporated into the drones called geofencing. So basically, there were no-fly zones where the drones simply would not be able to fly into these areas. So they'd be around, say, the airspace over the White House or airspace over military bases, that sort of thing. Well, just a few days ago, DJI decided to remove that protection on their drones. So DJI is based out of Shenzhen, China. They're a privately held company. There's always been concern that DJI drones are vacuuming up all the data over. Think about all the places that these drones fly all over the world. I mean, I've flown them on 6 continents in a professional capacity. Typically over mines or oil and gas or things like that, or just general films that I'm working on. There's always been speculation, and Pippa Malmgren, a former White House advisor, she's been public about this, saying that she believes that the data that's vacuumed up by these drones is, once you attach it back to the internet, that data goes up to the cloud, and the Chinese government just vacuums that stuff up.
Wow.
So just a few days ago, they removed this geofencing thing around their drones. So now it's on the drone operator to decide whether or not that drone, where it goes. And with the inauguration just a few days away, I think that's a shot across the bow of the incoming administration to say, look, obviously we know you have mitigation techniques to take care of drones, but we can definitely make your security environment really, really difficult. And I think this is most definitely a way that they're trying to do it. Now, do I think that there's going to be a bunch of DJI drones flying over the inauguration? Likely not, but they have to worry a little more than they were before.
I used to have a China region fund. I had the first one, and we shut it down 18 months ago. It didn't matter; it was good performance. It's just really an apathy towards the country, and the wisdom of crowds shows that. So to me, it's really interesting. What I'm seeing is what's characterized as a significant red Cold War. It's a Cold War, but it's red, and the two major players are Russia and China. Would you agree with that?
I would 100% agree with that. I mean, it's moving into a hot war in a lot of places. It's so similar to what was happening in the 60s and 70s, right? Even in the 80s, when you had all these wars, for instance, in Africa and Angola, in terms of what was going on there, that was really the Russians against the Americans, right?
Right.
So we're seeing the same thing in terms of what's happened in Ukraine, where it's, Russia, North Korea, and China versus, the rest of NATO and essentially the Americans.
And
So
Ukraine,
it's
I was told someone if Ukraine falls, John, that and North Koreans are there and fighting, and they win, then they'll give them an excuse to go and invade South Korea, and they give an excuse for China to take over Taiwan. And these are some of the things that in game theory you just don't expect that. But I was really surprised to see that North Korea has sent so many soldiers to fight for the Russians against the Ukraine.
I think everyone was surprised at that. However, if you take a step back and you put yourself in their shoes, it makes a ton of sense, right? When is the last time the North Koreans have been in active combat, since the Korean War, which, their grandfathers fought that war, right? So they have
Right.
no concept of what real war is. And I think there's, if you go back and read the history books about World War II, you talk to anyone that's been involved in actually active combat, there's no substitute for real world environment combat in terms of learning and education and understanding how it works. And I think it could be that just the North Korean brass decided, look, let's give them 10,000 of our soldiers. They'll gain all this experience, come back and help educate the rest of our soldiers, if we decide to make a move on South Korea or whatever we intend on doing. But, if you have a military and it's not used, it becomes rusty really quickly. And
Right.
there's no doubt that even China, to a certain extent, that's a problem that they have, that they haven't really been in serious combat since their civil war, really, so ended. So their military as well, despite the fact that they seem to be growing at exponential rates, I think there's always been an assumption, especially within the analyst community, that's saying, look, the learning curve is extremely steep, whereas the U.S. has been, essentially fighting. Have they stopped, since the end of World War II? Not really. They're always constantly engaged somewhere. So that definitely plays a role in terms of what I think the decision making that informed what the North Koreans have done. Not to mention, I'm sure Putin needed some extra. I mean, what they're doing there is totally crazy. So the way they fight. I had General Wesley Clark tell me not that long ago. He just said, you would not believe the degree of death and destruction that's happening on the Russian side of the line. He just said that their commanders have absolutely no respect for human life in terms of what's going on. He said
It's an interesting part because half of our budget, as General John Evans was saying, is actually taking care of people and continual health care, et cetera, for the soldiers. And when you look at skilled workers in Russia or China, they're making these icebreakers or destroyers, et cetera. They're making $3.50 an hour. There's no union, there's no regulations compared to what we have. And we're paying $35 an hour with lots of regulations. So really, when you see China spending $250 billion and you look at the GDP per capita ratio, that could be like $2 trillion they're spending. So they really are
Yeah.
spending us. It becomes that concern. And then the next part to add to that, coming back to resource wars, is Greenland. And I was doing some research, and I was so surprised to think that they said the potential is more oil than Iraq, and also strategic minerals and metals. Could you give some more color of what you understand about Greenland? It's so rich with these resources.
Greenland is loaded with rare earth minerals, right? And China controls what it's 97, 98% of that global market. So if you're the US and you need these rare earth minerals for all your high-tech weaponry, not to mention all the electronics all of us use in our daily life, and you already know that China has the chokehold on that, which they really do, then you need to get engaged somewhere. And Greenland is the obvious place, not to mention strategically just where it's located. It's, the US is trying to get the higher ground, right? They're trying to grab it before somebody else does. And I think that's what informs what's going on in Greenland. And that's certainly what's going on in the Panama Canal situation. So when it comes to Greenland, there's only a few companies that are active there. Exploration's difficult because it's really cold, and nobody's really explored there. So if you think of like globally, if you think of countries that are still, virgin territories that have not been explored, there's only a few of them left. Greenland's one of them. Iran's really interesting because there's been no modern really methods applied to their oil and gas sector to find out how much what their reserves truly are, right? Which I think that informs a lot of what's going on. The rest of the world, there's North Korea, who knows what they have, but the rest of the world is to a great extent explored. Antarctica is interesting also, but Greenland is definitely virgin territory, and if you're the U.S. business community, underneath Trump, and you're saying, look, we're always looking for new areas to explore, and then you apply over top of that, you lay the template of how the Pentagon sees the world, and you say Greenland's incredibly strategically important, just given its location in the Arctic, and kind of a gateway to North America from Europe and Russia, then it just makes a ton of sense that you have to get a hold of that somehow. And I don't know how it's going to happen. Apparently, I just read myself a few days ago that I guess Trump is the third U.S. president to try to get a hold of it. But and we'll see how this is all going to shake out. But my guess is, if I was a betting man, by 2028, Greenland will be a territory of the U.S. I don't know how it's going to work, but I think there's going to be some sort of an arrangement made. That's my guess.
And what about the 51st state? Because all my Canadian dear friends are upset about the fact that we put on the table, and then you've got Kevin O'Leary that's all promoting it. What do you think, and what does your circle of friends think about that whole idea?
That is a really interesting question. So it's split into two camps. So when I speak to, I ran into a longtime family friend who runs a very, very, very large company that operates throughout Western Canada. I won't talk about the sector it's in because you'll figure out pretty quickly what it is. And but let's just say he's very influential. So he's on the business side of things, and he just he asked me the question. He just said, what is Canada? What are we now? And just from a pure business point of view, it makes a ton of sense to have some sort of economic union with the United States, because then he can expand into the U.S. The taxes are lower. U.S. dollar would be used, all of that. And if the trade is sovereignty, then why not? Because when you boil it down, aren't we kind of doing what the U.S. wants us to do anyway? And at the same time, we're also being infiltrated clearly by the Chinese and the Indians, but the Chinese in particular in government. So doesn't it make sense? So there's the business community side of things, and then there's just the average guy on the street that you talk to, and you talk to them, and I think universally people are not liking the idea. But as soon as you kind of dig down a little bit and say, look, what is Canada? Especially, this gets into kind of a rabbit hole here, Frank, but when Trudeau was elected, Justin Trudeau, when he's elected prime minister back in 2015, one of the first interviews, I think the first interview he gave was to the New York Times. And he told the New York Times that that Canada was a post-national state with no center. In other words, we're just this, nebulous, political entity that's sitting in this northern part of a continent with no center. Well, I mean, there's been a huge political reaction to that over the last, 9, 10 years. But if you look at it from that standpoint, then you start asking yourself, well, all of a sudden Trudeau's become a nationalist and the Liberal Party's become, Canadian nationalists. But I think there's a real question to be asked. What is Canada? What does the future look like? We're clearly being influenced by outside powers. China has a stranglehold on many of our the political apparatus in Canada. There's no debate about that. So, and been trying to edge further and further into our resource sector. So, at a certain point, you knew the U.S. was going to get involved and say, "Look, that Chinese influence has to go," right? And I think the shot was fired when they grabbed the Huawei woman in Vancouver, if you remember that story.
Remember?
She was grabbed in Vancouver because Trudeau was in the process of negotiating a free trade agreement with China, right? I mean, think about that. Justin Trudeau was negotiating a free trade agreement with China when that happened. And obviously, the fact that she was nabbed in Canada, that ended that conversation really quickly. But that gives you an idea of how close Canada politically, the political elites in this country, have been drawing to China over the last, 8 or 9 years. It's obviously been going on a lot longer than that. But I think if you're the U.S., you're saying, look, this has to stop. This has to stop, and whatever it looks like, it's going to stop. So
I think a lot of people, Jonathan, don't realize that many of the big private corporations in China are controlled by generals. And that's how they're all rich. You don't have that in America. Generals worth $1 billion from procuring things. And so Howie, I believe that was his daughter, was a CFO.
Yeah,
and so now we've had that telecom scandal that was done here in the U.S. where the Chinese were in cybersecurity breach in telecom centers. So I think from that end, it is pretty serious where it's growing. And but most interesting was to have you on to talk about resources and because you're the guy of resource wars, and it appears that we're going to continue to see lots of action over the next 4 years.
we sure are. I mean, look, if you want to get blunt about it, 2027 seems to be the year that if you talk to people privately, it seems clear that both within the U.S. military and even publicly what Xi Jinping's saying, that's the year to look at in terms of reunification with Taiwan and how the U.S. views it, that by 2027, there's going to be a kinetic war going on. So, I mean, things are serious. There's no question that, the world's powers are ramping up for something. We can already see what that something is. And I think everyone needs to be aware of it, especially within the financial community.
Well, thank you. And everyone for listening. Jonathan Roth, from TV producer to journalist, as a Canadian and also as a global citizen. So thank you so much for your observations and thoughts.
Thanks for having me on, Frank.